For me as a therapist working with this group, what do I do with this? And if you're working with similar children and adolescents, what do you potentially take away from this? Because this leaves us in a bit of a conundrum. We've got children that we want to show care to, but if you show them care, they become dysregulated and it actually activates their fight or flight response. As you know, I work mostly with adolescents within a youth justice context, and within that work I draw upon the developmental trauma research a lot. My PhD is focusing on trauma-informed practice, and from a psychotherapy perspective, so in the one-to-one work I utilise a lot of empathy and compassion and those kind of skills, which for most workers in this area, whether you're a therapist, whether you're a social worker or a teacher or a youth worker or a foster carer, and all of those kind of jobs, empathy and compassion are skills that come quite natural to us. It's kind of what drew us into those careers to begin with. But reading this paper that I'm about to quickly go through and give an overview of has really made me think how I use compassion and how I show care and compassion. And it's definitely impacted my practice. So this paper was published in 2022 in the Journal of Criminal Justice. And I'll put on the screen the header so I can credit the authors appropriately, and the full link will be in the description if you want to read the whole paper. And what the researchers did was take 97 what they called community adolescents between the ages of 14 and 18. So we had one group one, who were between the ages of 14 and 18, and they called these community adolescents. And these were people from the general population with no diagnosed psychopathology, no current psychological treatment, and they weren't taking any medication. And we had 97 of them. They then took 99 people. So group 2, they took 99 of the same age, and they referred to this group as the forensic sample. And throughout the paper, they also referred to them as young offenders. It's not my language, that's the language used in the paper. So these are adolescents who have a diagnosis of conduct disorder, or they have a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, so ODD. And this group were currently placed within a Portuguese juvenile detention centre, is what they call it. Juvenile detention centre. So essentially we have two groups. We have group 1, who are adolescents that you would pluck out of the community, and we've got a second group, a similar number, who are in custody. They're in a Portuguese juvenile detention centre, and they have a diagnosis of conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. And what we know from other research is that a very high percentage of children and adolescents who are in custody or have been in custody have experienced developmental trauma. Developmental trauma. We do have some other demographics. I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm just going to talk about the ones that are the most relevant. You can read the whole paper if you want to. What we found is in this sample, so group 2, the forensic sample, 94% were from a low socio-economic status or socio-economic background, and they had also completed fewer years of education when compared with the other group. So actually this group between the ages of 14 and 18 had completed 5 years of education in total throughout their life versus 10 years of this group. So this group had 10 years of education. Okay, so we've got our two groups, and I think it's quite clear what they're trying to represent here. And what they did was they exposed each of the groups to what they call a standardized procedure. So we have a standardized procedure. So the procedure starts with an instructions section, which provided the participants with all of the information of what's going to happen, what's going to follow. So we have let's see if I can do this. So we have a kind of a beginning phase where they're given information. Beginning, given information. And this is then followed by a resting phase. And the resting phase is 5 minutes where they were presented with an emotional neutral task. So in this instance, they were presented with just neutral images, which just flash up for about 5 seconds and they look at them. Okay, they're not supposed to prompt any kind of reaction at all. So we go from beginning the information to this resting phase, which lasts for 5 minutes, and it's an emotional neutral task. After this phase, the participants then answered a self-reported scale regarding how they felt during this period. So they rate the emotional intensity of this. Next, the participants go into what is called a reactivity phase, where they listen to a 5-minute audio scenario which aim to trigger one of 3 emotional regulation systems. Okay, so they're going into this. So this is the reactivity, and that lasts for 5 minutes. And what this tries to do is activate one of the 3 emotional regulation systems. So these are the threat system, the drive system. So that's a system to motivate to do things and get things done for rewards, or the soothing system. If you know about something called compassion focused therapy, then you'll notice these as the 3 systems from that model. These are the 3 systems that we directly try to work with. So immediately after hearing this audio, they go into another recovery phase of 5 minutes, which is where they're given another emotional neutral task. So they're shown neutral images again. And then after those 5 minutes, there's a rating of the emotional intensity of how they felt during the audio phase, that reactivity phase, and the recovery phase. So just to visually show that, this reactivity goes into a recovery phase, again of 5 minutes, with an emotional neutral task. And then after this, they're asked to rate the emotional intensity of this and of this. And then this whole sequence, this whole procedure is repeated 3 times. And the reason for that is they do it one time with one of the systems, so say the threat system, one time with the drive system, and one time with the soothing system. And they randomize what order it goes in. And one other thing that happens is that during all of this, so from the first resting phase, let me change this to another color. So from the first resting phase all the way through to here, to them rating the emotional intensity, during all of this, they are measuring HRV. So if you don't know, your heartbeat doesn't beat like a metronome. If you take your heart rate and let's say it's 60 beats per minute, the time between those beats isn't exactly 1 second. It fluctuates slightly depending on what state your body is in. So to simplify this, the HRV reflects the balance between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. If you think back to my fight, flight, freeze videos, then we know that the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight system and the parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest system. So HRV is heart rate variability. And when we think about this, the numbers sound like they're a little bit backwards when it comes to HRV. So the higher your HRV, the better your body is at adapting to different situations, and it usually indicates better emotional regulation and less stress. A low HRV or a decreased HRV is often referred to as a general marker of decreased capacity for emotional regulation. So worse emotional regulation, higher levels of stress. So in this context, the higher the HRV, the better. This is healthier. Generally speaking, there's probably outliers to this, but generally speaking, this is what we're looking for. So what they end up with in this study is they end up with the HRV data for both groups of participants, which changes during the standardized process that they were all put through. So we end up with a physiological measure of what's happened to the participants through the process, and we end up with their self-reported measures of how they felt and their emotional reactions to the process. And what they found is incredibly interesting, especially when we look at the soothing system. They found that in the community group, so this group, in group 1, that the HRV increased when in the soothing reactive process, and then decrease slightly during the recovery phase once the soothing had finished. And this is what the authors expect to see. That makes sense. Someone is soothed, their HRV increases, which means it's healthier. And then once the soothing has stopped and they come into the recovery phases, then because the soothing has stopped, the heart rate variability just drops slightly. That's what we expect to see. However, for the this group, the forensic group or the young offenders group, there were significant decreases in HRV when triggering the soothing system. So this means that the soothing phases were not able to produce parasympathetic nervous system activity increase. In other words, they were unable to turn on their rest and digest system when exposed to a soothing stimulus. In fact, the opposite was found. It actually increased their fight or flight response. So just to make this clear, you give this group a soothing stimulus, activate their soothing response, their rest and digest is not activated, and actually their fight or flight response increases. So to quote the authors directly here, so you know exactly what they said, so you know I'm not misinterpreting or misrepresenting this. In sum, as in to summarize, kindness and compassion can be perceived as potential threats due to the individual's aversive emotional memories, which can lead to fight, flight, or shutdown responses. The soothing system activity is mediated by parasympathetic nervous system activity, and in young offenders our findings seem to support an underdeveloped soothing system that, when elicited, does not promote heart rate variability increases. Thus, not only parasympathetic nervous system activity decreased when triggering the system, but young offenders also display a physiological pattern that seems similar to the one corresponding to the threat system. Another interesting finding is that of the self-reported emotions. So remember, during the standardized process, participants were asked to self-report at various stages. Well, what they found was that there was a mismatch between what their bodies were doing and their self-report of how they were feeling. So within the forensic sample, or the young offenders, they found that they reported feeling more soothing emotions during the soothing phase than the community adolescents. So this means that when they were asked, they described themselves as feeling calm, safe, or tranquil. However, what their bodies showed is low heart rate variability, which is linked to stress or poor emotion regulation, not feeling calm or calmness. So physiologically, it looked like they were actually experiencing distress rather than genuine soothing. So this mismatch can occur because of something called interoception, which is how we sense, how we understand, what sense we make of signals from our own body. So if someone's interoceptive skills are impaired, then they might misinterpret their physiological state. And we know from my Domains of Trauma video and the research around that this is one of the areas that is impaired by developmental trauma. So for me as a therapist working with this group, what do I do with this? Because this leaves us in a bit of a conundrum. We've got children that we want to show care to, but if you show them care, they become dysregulated and it actually activates their fight or flight response. And if you're working with similar children and adolescents, what do you potentially take away from this? Well, first of all, I think there's awareness here that if you are showing compassion or trying to cultivate some self-compassion in someone else, then there's resistances to this. There's resistances to that process, perhaps resistance to you showing them care and compassion that isn't done consciously. They're not purposely reacting in the way that they're reacting. It might seem that way on the surface, but that doesn't appear to be what's going on. And being aware that as well as them not responding to that compassion and care, as you may expect, it can actually lead to greater activation of the threat system. And if you know your child or you know your adolescent that you're working with, then you might have some idea of how that comes out, what that looks like for them when their threat system is activated and the behaviours that they show. So if you see those behaviours now after showing them some compassion, then maybe this will help to explain what's going on there. I think this also speaks to showing care and compassion gradually. So similar to graded exposure, where we start small, we can start with small bits of compassion and build up when we see that is being received okay. And as a worker, that might feel really odd. You might feel like you want to shower this child or this adolescent with care and compassion because they deserve it. But that can overwhelm them. So be a bit cautious and actively think about what you are doing and how you are showing that care and compassion and how that is being received. Okay, don't get caught in this potential cycle of thinking you're not showing enough compassion and then trying to step it up even further, and then dysregulating them even further. I hope that makes sense. So I thought I would share this. I thought this was a really interesting study, because often, certainly in training that I've been to, we talk about this idea of, do you remember those toy houses you used to get with children, and they'd have different shapes in the top, like a square, a circle and a star, and you'd have to get the right corresponding shape and put it in? Well, I've heard this analogy of, if you try to show care or compassion to a child who's experiencing developmental trauma, it's a bit like trying to fit a circle through the star hole. Like, it doesn't fit, because the child doesn't know what to do with that care. They've got nowhere to kind of put it. And that analogy kind of made sense on the surface, but I didn't know of any research that underpinned that. I thought it was just one of those things that people say in training and you kind of just go with. But I think this research demonstrates exactly what they mean by that. And that's really important to me to understand that, because that's what helps guide my practice. So I hope you found this interesting. I certainly did. It's definitely made me consider some elements of my own practice. So thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Goodbye.